Imagine an empire so vast it spanned 11 time zones, an economy so centralized that every nail, every loaf of bread, every factory output was planned by committees in Moscow. And then imagine that same system, built on total control, collapsing not from external attack, but from its own internal logic. The Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War. It lost to mathematics. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history intertwine to shape the world we live in. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we need to abandon the comfortable Cold War narrative and examine something far more unsettling: how a system built on scientific planning became scientifically impossible to sustain. The story begins in October 1917, when Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, promising to end the chaos of capitalism. Their vision? Replace the market's anarchy with rational, centralized planning. By 1928, Stalin had transformed this vision into reality with the first five-year plan. The logic seemed bulletproof. If we can calculate how much steel, wheat, and machinery a nation needs, why leave it to profit-seeking capitalists? Instead, Gosplan, the state planning committee, would coordinate everything. Every factory, every farm, every resource allocation would serve the collective good. And initially, it worked, sort of. Between 1928 and 1940, Soviet industrial output grew at staggering rates. Official figures claimed 16% annually. The USSR transformed from an agrarian backwater into an industrial powerhouse, capable of defeating Nazi Germany. By 1957, Sputnik orbited Earth. Soviet achievements in heavy industry, military hardware, and science were undeniable. But beneath the propaganda, something was already breaking. The system had a fatal flaw built into its DNA: the calculation problem. Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises identified it in 1920, long before the Soviet collapse. Without market prices, he argued, rational economic calculation becomes impossible. Prices aren't just numbers. They're information signals encoding millions of individual decisions, resource scarcities, and preferences. The Soviets dismissed this as capitalist propaganda. They had scientists, engineers, computers. Surely they could calculate everything. They couldn't. Through the 1950s and 60s, the USSR maintained impressive growth rates, particularly in heavy industry and defense. Premier Nikita Khrushchev famously boasted, "We will bury you," predicting Soviet economic superiority by 1980. But the cracks were widening. The central planning apparatus faced an impossible task: coordinating approximately 24 million products across 47,000 industrial enterprises and 27,000 collective farms. Gosplan's economists produced annual plans running to thousands of pages, setting production quotas for everything from ball bearings to tractors. The problem? Every plan was obsolete before implementation. Here's how the contradiction worked. Factories received production quotas measured in tons, units, or rubles. Managers, evaluated on meeting these quotas, optimized for the wrong metrics. If quota measured tonnage, factories produced heavier products. If measured in units, they produced smaller items. The infamous Soviet nail factory story illustrates this perfectly. When quotas measured weight, factories produced enormous, useless nails. When measured by quantity, they produced tiny, equally useless ones. Without real prices reflecting actual scarcity, managers had no way to know what society actually needed. Shortages bred a parallel economy. By the 1970s, an estimated 20-30% of Soviet GDP flowed through unofficial channels, the Blatt system of personal connections and black markets. Want car parts? Know someone. Need quality meat? Have connections. The planned economy couldn't function without the unplanned one. Meanwhile, the military-industrial complex consumed 15-20% of Soviet GDP throughout the Cold War. Some Western estimates placed it as high as 25%. This enormous burden drained resources from consumer goods and technological innovation in civilian sectors. Technological stagnation accelerated. While Western economies surged ahead with computers, telecommunications, and flexible manufacturing, Soviet industry remained locked in steel and concrete. By 1980, the USSR produced more steel than the United States, but generated far less economic value. The oil boom of the 1970s masked these problems temporarily. Energy exports to the West brought hard currency. Soviet oil production peaked at 12.5 million barrels per day in 1983. But when oil prices collapsed in 1986, falling from $30 to below $10 per barrel, the facade crumbled. Mikhail Gorbachev inherited this dying system in 1985. His response, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, attempted to reform the unreformable. The reforms exposed the central paradox. You cannot partially plan an economy. It's binary. Either prices coordinate resources through markets or planners do. Gorbachev tried both simultaneously. The result was catastrophic. State enterprises gained more autonomy, but still operated within planned quotas. Prices remained controlled, but some market mechanisms were introduced. The hybrid system produced the worst of both worlds. Shortages intensified, inflation accelerated, and coordination collapsed entirely. By 1990, Soviet GDP was contracting. Store shelves emptied, regional governments hoarded supplies. In 1991, the CIA estimated Soviet GDP at $2.7 trillion, roughly one-third of the U.S. economy, far below previous estimates. The August 1991 coup attempt by hardline communists seeking to reverse reforms failed within 3 days. The old system had lost legitimacy completely. On December 8, 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords dissolving the Soviet Union. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag came down. But what killed the USSR wasn't Western military pressure or ideological defeat. It was the mathematical impossibility of centrally planning 300 million lives across 11 time zones without price signals to coordinate activity. The system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Soviet experiment ended, but the lessons echo today. Modern China presents a fascinating counterpoint, maintaining political centralization while embracing market pricing mechanisms. The result? Economic growth averaging 9 to 10% annually from 1980 to 2010. The crucial difference? Prices, not Politburo committees, allocate most resources. Yet elements of Soviet-style planning persist globally. Venezuela's price controls and currency restrictions produced similar shortages. Inflation reached 130,060% in 2018. Zimbabwe's land redistribution program, disconnected from market signals, contributed to agricultural collapse and hyperinflation, exceeding 79.6 billion % monthly in 2008. Even Western economies face versions of the calculation problem when governments override price signals. Rent control creating housing shortages, agricultural subsidies distorting production, healthcare price controls affecting supply. The fundamental insight remains: information is decentralized, distributed across billions of individual decisions. No committee, regardless of computational power, can replicate the information processing capability of market prices. The Soviet collapse wasn't just about communism versus capitalism. It was about information theory, coordination problems, and the limits of central planning in complex systems. 3 lessons from the Soviet collapse. 1. Systems optimized for control, sacrifice, adaptability. The USSR achieved military might but couldn't produce decent shoes. 2. Ideology disconnected from economic reality eventually meets mathematical constraints. You cannot will away scarcity. 3. Information matters more than intention. Even planners with perfect motives faced an impossible calculation problem. The Soviet experiment lasted 74 years, a blink in history's timeline. It promised scientific planning and delivered systematic failure, not because the planners were evil, but because the task they attempted was fundamentally impossible. Every system, every empire, every economic order carries internal contradictions. The question isn't whether they'll emerge, but when. Because in the timeline of wealth, every rise comes with a hidden cost, and sometimes that cost is the system itself. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because history's next secret is already unfolding.